Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade, and today my guest is Gwen. Welcome, Gwen. So glad you're here.
Hi, Gay. Thanks for having me.
It's a treat to have you on. Gwen is a pillar of the Cube community these days, a designer, an event organizer, and a developer. We should say the founder of CubeCobra. So there are a lot of things we get to explore together today. One of your most peculiar and most well-known cubes is Loam Cube. I'd love to start by chatting a little bit about that. Can you give us an overview for Loam Cube?
Yeah, so Loam Cube is a cube that I kind of spurred out of an idea I had when I was just kind of brainstorming like wacky cube ideas, and something about it like really appealed to me, and so I ended up building it. But the concept of it is everybody should always have access to the card Life from the Loam. And the way I do this is it starts in every player's graveyard, and there's no cards in the cube that can permanently answer it. So there's no like surgical extraction or something like that. In fact, the graveyard hate is very, very thin. And it's also a desert cube, so you have to draft all your lands. And there's also no white cards because white doesn't really go as deep into the themes that the rest of the cube has. So it felt better just to omit it entirely.
Yeah, so several things to unpack there. One, I think a principle that I really appreciate that you celebrate is that players can't remove life from the loam, or like that you're not punished for doing that thing.
Yeah, the phrase I usually use is I don't want to punish my players for doing the thing that I'm trying to get them to do. And this is kind of like a pitfall that I've seen some cubes fall in. And so this is something I explicitly wanted to avoid with my cube.
Is that something that players have requested? Like, is that something you have to temper player feedback and just say, no, we're not doing this?
I have played a few cubes that have advertised themselves as a graveyard cube. And in most of them, what I've seen is they just have a lot of graveyard hate. And it feels almost bad to try to do the graveyard thing because you get blown out so hard by graveyard hate, and also like white's color identity is mainly graveyard hate is a theme I've seen a lot, and so that influenced my decisions quite a bit. And players have seemed to really enjoy it. Like they feel like they can safely, dredge every turn and like craft these loops into their deck without fear of just getting completely blown out, which really works. If anything, players have actually asked for a little more graveyard hate for things like creatures, because
Sure.
there are cards like Hogak that are well, Hogak I did recently cut, but historically, like Hogak has been a problem because it's just so hard to answer. It's like the two ways you traditionally answer it are you can exile out of the graveyard, but there's not a lot of graveyard hate, or you can exile it once it's in play. But since you don't have access to white, the removal that exiles is also pretty thin.
I didn't think about that not having white means you wouldn't have access to like to high octane exile based removal. That's an interesting puzzle to solve. Was the cube being desert a part of your original plan, or was that something that came up along the way as you were theory crafting?
It wasn't part of the original plan, but as I started brainstorming the actual cube list, I found myself just putting a lot of lands in the list because I wanted to include all these lands that kind of play off the fact that you can build them over and get them back. And so there's like utility stuff. And once I started getting into it, I was talking a ton with Bones about it. And obviously, Bones is well known for his multiple desert cubes, all of which are like really, really high quality, and so his cubes were like a huge inspiration. And so that's kind of what made me want to make the jump to try out desert cube. This is the first time I've done a desert cube, so like my numbers were initially really based off of almond card desert cube, and then I actually went the opposite way where almond card is kind of like a struggle to get the pips you need to. Every pick feels like there's a huge amount of tension between being able to get the land that you want or being able to get a spell, and like the entire draft just feels stressful, like you're trying to fight for the limited resources. But Loam Cube is kind of the opposite. The land count is much higher, and the quality of lands is also much higher. So it's pretty common to see most of the table in a three color deck, and the fixing just lets you do that.
And the other core of that is you described that everybody needs to be able to play green to maximize life from the loam, right?
Yeah, and yeah, so that's true. I always recommend for new players to play green. There are a few people who have tried to not play green, and they usually train wreck. But we have had one trophy with a player who just decided to play mono red. They still did make use of the life from the loam with things like deep graveyard synergies, and they had a lot of madness cards and a lot of ways to discard. So they were just like dredging their loam and then just discarding it to a random discard outlet, just as a way to gain threshold or put a bunch of lands in the graveyard for some other synergy.
That does seem like an achievement unlocked sort of thing if you're able to to do the thing without touching the loam color itself.
Yeah, like I said, I wouldn't recommend it. It almost always train wrecks.
so so maybe don't do that your first time.
Yeah, but the colors actually, because everyone's playing green and because it's a four color cube, the way you can think about like the color pairs are actually kind of different. So it's like the green section is the biggest section, and this section is kind of, you can think of every player has access to this section because everyone's probably playing green, and then red and black are the next biggest sections because they kind of go the deepest into the themes. Blue is a little smaller because there's just not as much in there. So you just see less blue decks overall. But also, if you think of the color like Simic is actually just blue cards. Golgari is actually just black cards because you can assume you're playing green already. And then if you have a section like Is It is particularly tough because you immediately are putting yourself into a three color deck. So that's like the section that I've like struggled the most with. And then there's also like a couple three color cards. And so the one that's the toughest is like the Grixis section because if you're playing a Grixis card, you're playing every color in the cube.
That's really interesting. I hadn't considered how that would play out because, like you noted, if you're anchored in green, then then all those others are kind of extra. Like you have to add those all in intentionally.
Yeah, exactly. And that also influences the archetypes that you have access to and also the types of lands that are included. So like the numbers on the lands are really crazy. There's some two color sections that have like 10 non-basic lands and some that only have like 5 just because what it means to be two color and three color is just a little different in this cube.
In conjunction with land numbers being a little wonky sometimes, you break singleton on a couple of cards here. I'm seeing something like Arclight Phoenix. Is that just to bolster certain archetypes, or is there something beyond that?
Yeah, so the two non-land cards that break singleton for are Arclight Phoenix and Risen Reef. And those may feel like really odd cards to break singleton on, but they both kind of have different reasoning behind them. So on Arclight Phoenix, I really wanted to encourage like this like Spellslingers kind of deck, and I really struggled seeing it come together, and I wasn't really sure why. It seemed like there are a lot of the good pieces, and I think ultimately what was the biggest issue with the deck is you really wanted to be three colors like right off the bat, and that was tough. So adding the second Arclight Phoenix really helped that deck be a little more viable, just as you want to be milling every turn, you want to be dredging every turn, and so having the extra density of Arclight Phoenixes, if you get both of them, really helps just kind of smooth things out for that archetype specifically. I still think it's a little on the weaker side, so it's something that I'm still looking at. But the Arclight Phoenix is definitely like a cornerstone of the deck. It's very powerful. It's really iconic. And for Risen Reef, there's an emergent archetype where one time it was Cubepalooza last year, I believe, in 2023, and one of the drafters, his name is Justin. He has this really beautiful altered cube, and he drafted Loam Cube, and he came up to me and he's like, "Oh, cool! I drafted elementals," and I was like, what does that mean? Elementals is not like a deck I put into the cube, and I looked at his deck, and it was like all elementals, and there was like a handful of like synergies with the fact that most of his cards are elementals. Like the one I can think of is there's the 3 mana Nissa that has like landfall. You can get a mana, and then if you get a second time, you can. All right, if you get a second time, you get another mana. But if you do a third time, you get a like cascade into an elf or elemental. There's no elves in the cube, but there are actually quite a bit of elementals just randomly. And his deck actually did quite good. He did lose in the finals, but it was a pretty strong deck. And so I decided to just lean into that a little harder, and so I added Risen Reef and then a couple other elemental synergies. But as I kind of polished the cube, uh, that deck kind of just fell behind. But by adding a second Risen Reef, it now feels like something to work towards. Like if you see the first Risen Reef, you can pick it up early and pick up a bunch of elementals, and then once you get the second one, then your deck really kind of like starts coming together.
I love that principle too of a player coming to you saying, "Hey, I did this thing that's kind of off the wall that maybe you didn't build into the environment." And rather than going, "Okay, that's weird. Thanks for that." Going, "Okay, no, I want this to happen more," and the building of the tools to make that happen.
Yeah, and then there's also I break singleton on a few lands. As you may have noticed, all the lands I break singleton for are caves. So I used to break singleton on every single cave, but then Modern Horizons printed a few new caves, and those are powerful enough that I felt breaking singleton on them wasn't correct. And that's things like Urza's Cave. I think it's called Sunken Ruins. It's the blue cave, is what I usually call it. But all the Ixalan caves you can see two copies of. I think there's like one or two that I chose not to include. And then there's a handful of cards that actually care about the cave subtype. So you have like Cosmium Confluence, Spelunking, just a very, very like light theme there. And the reasoning behind that is there's a very wide spectrum of quality in lands, like by design. Like there's dual lands and fetch lands in here, but then all the way at the bottom there's a bunch of caves.
Yeah, yeah. Talk about that a little bit because that kind of widespread is not something that you see very often.
Yeah, and so the idea is that there is enough fixing that you should have no real problem getting 17 lands, but a lot of decks want more than 17 lands. And also, the quality of your mana base heavily depends on how you value the lands. So if you're looking to pick up lands, as your first few picks, your mana base is probably going to have a few dual lands, shocks, fetches, triumphs in there, and it's going to be really high powered. But if you're leaning towards the spells, you're probably going to find yourself in a spot where you're just picking up what you can find, and that's usually the caves, just because they're the worst lands in the cube. A lot of them tap for colorless. A lot of them do fix your colors really well though, and a lot of them have like surprising synergies. So one of the like cornerstone caves is this one that it gives all your other caves like a city of brass effect. And so if you're really struggling for fixing, but you have a handful of caves, that's a really valuable land because it kind of gives you like an escape hatch in order to make your deck a little viable.
Intentionally building the, if you want to call it the bottom of the mana base, to be something that's viable in its own right is that's a cool fix for that.
Yeah, and the player base, like my local player group, is a little split on this. We did have a roto draft once where I completely ignored lands, and for the first like 10 picks, a lot of people were fighting over the highest quality lands, and I was able to just take whatever spell I wanted to, and I ended up with a mana base of like 15 or so, maybe less, caves, and I had like all the caves matters cards, and my deck worked pretty good, partly because I was able to have really powerful spells, and the mana base is just good enough to make it work. But it did noticeably perform worse, and a lot of people think that it's just worse enough than just picking playable lands that it shouldn't be included at all. But I like that it's an option that it's there.
Well, I imagine rotisserie drafting a desert cube is also going to contribute to some oddities that you don't normally experience in other places.
I actually like roto drafting desert cubes. I think it should be done more. We do like 45 picks, so you always just have a 5 card sideboard, and it's a lot of fun.
And you definitely need to eat your vegetables there, otherwise, lands can dry up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I saw someone else roto drafting this cube. Like, there's a play group that was just playing online, and they're trying to play mono green. It looked like, and they're sleeping on their land so much that all the basic forests had been picked.
Oh
And
no.
I'm not sure if like they were told that it was a desert cube because their draft didn't look like it.
I think that's been the bane of desert drafters since it's been around. The number of times that somebody will sit down and not know that it's a desert and then realize after, a little too late. One of my favorite quotes in your overview, you say, I never claimed to have a balanced cube.
Yeah. So historically, there have been a handful of power outliers that I've known about and just kind of accepted. And the boogeymen have really been Ayula's influence, seismic assault, and Hogak. And I did eventually cut them like about a month ago. So I needed to update my overview. But yeah, like the cube is really high variance. There's this a lot of really crazy synergies that you can craft, and it's just very very difficult to balance. And I'm also happy with a few cards that are like iconic. Cards just being the best cards in the cube, and if every card is like equal power level, things can also feel a little more bland. When you open a pack, it's not as exciting.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, then it can feel flat. If you shave off all the edges, then there's nothing to catch on to. Do you have a benchmark of power you're trying to attain? Or like, I mean, clearly Loam is the key card, but are there particular payoffs that you're trying to make sure shine?
I think the powers shifted quite a bit since I first designed the cube. In the first revision, I did have a very tangible benchmark. I wanted like Arrogant Worm to be playable. And the reason was because I wanted Madness, because Madness is cool with Loam, because if you're playing Madness, you want a discard outlet. And Loam works really well with discard outlets because it lets you launder cards like lands into real cards. And so these things all kind of like blend together to contribute to this kind of very malleable mushy pile of archetypes. And so Madness was really important for me, but as I've tuned the cube, I found that the Madness cards kind of got powered out. And I've been thinking about it lately if I want to try to power back down to like the original benchmark I had, or just kind of accept that it's at a higher power level now and work around that. And that's just overall something I still trying to figure out with the cube.
What do you think would sway your decision one way or the other on that?
Well, I think that when you're talking about the more powerful cards, it's also cards that you see a lot in other cubes. And I am trying to create like a very novel experience. But if you're still playing, like the best cards out of the cubes, then you're not really like playing off the novelty factor of having Life from the Loam in your graveyard every game. And so I wanted to try to have like these kind of low power archetypes, more like dirtly stuff, and have the game focused around that rather than these like crazy combos that can win the game on the spot. There are still a few combos like that. Like I have Underworld Breach, and if you have cards like Frantic Search, you can just like mill your entire deck. And so there's a couple situations like that, but I think the cube is still mostly about playing to the board rather than just digging for combos. There's a lot of angles you can go when you're actually playing it.
I've had that happen to me, and I know other designers have too, where you start with a certain power band in mind, and then things shift, usually upward. Times change, and there's no reason you can't change back, right?
Yeah, I could definitely look at powering down. Maybe coming up with like an alternate version where the really broken stuff is cut, like Underworld Breach or Next of It. And these cards aren't even like necessarily good. They just facilitate very high powered plays.
Yeah, I something like Nexus of Fate, kind of a boogeyman because of its constructed history, but I can't imagine most people are generating infinite turn loops with this.
So Nexus of Fate is actually a second copy of Laboratory Maniac. This is how it plays out in this cube: is if you're just milling yourself every turn, eventually you can get to a spot where you just have Nexus of Fate and you draw it, play it, and that's how you kind of come about. So I think that road draft I was talking about earlier, the winner with the best record was Theo with this green blue Nexus of Fate deck. All he did was just play counter spells, ramp, and Nexus of Fate, and then he would just try to figure out a way to win once he actually what was in infinite turns. His deck was really cool.
Boy, and I just got to be a live example of misevaluating something like this. I imagine that's easy to do, of looking and going, "Ah, well, that's probably not gonna happen," and then it certainly does.
Yeah, I mean the fact that you can dredge three every single turn makes it so like you can just mill yourself out a lot quicker. There's a couple other dredge cards like Theo also had Golgari Grave Troll, which like really accelerated him. He was able to mill that over early.
Do you find that players respond well to this kind of unique environment?
The reception has been pretty good. Players get a lot of fatigue when they draft this cube, just because when you play it, you have access to so many more cards than you normally do in a game of Magic. If you think of dredging every turn and putting three cards in your graveyard, but then your deck is around using those cards in your graveyard, you're kind of drawing three cards every single turn. And as a result, the decision trees are just so wide that it can be really tough to play and to kind of navigate the game. And so I've had issues with players playing really slow because they get overwhelmed. And also just at the end of the draft, players just like I need to take a break from Magic. I need to take a walk. Yeah, just because it
I need to
it
go
it
outside. Yeah.
it literally can be really fatiguing on the brain, unfortunately.
What have you found most surprising about working on Loam Cube?
I think the thing that I've struggled with the most is that I always feel like I've boosted Is It to be better, and people still don't play it. And that's been tough. Is It is kind of like unique among the guilds. Rakdos is as well, and Demir. Those are like the three, like the non-green guilds. Rakdos has benefit from having the second and third best colors, but Izzet and Demir kind of suffer the most. Demir, I was able to add a lot of like these discard synergies in. So you think of like cards like Zombie Infestation, Trade Routes, Bone Miser. You're able to craft these like pretty interesting discard engines. But is it I the only thing I can really think of is like a spell slingers thing. The one card that I think really made it pop is the Lost and Damned, I believe.
Yeah, from 40K.
Yeah. And that card is almost perfect.
Yeah, I'm looking at it on your list here. This is really cool.
Yeah, so it says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control from anywhere other than your hand, or you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, create a 3/3 red spawn creature token. And a 3/3 is like a solid body here. There's definitely like the creature sizing is also really weird. There's a lot of like Goif cards that are just really cheap and really big, but you can go wide with cards like this. So 3/3 is like totally respectable. And so blue red has a lot of like flashback cards. It has cards like Flame Jab with Retrace that you can play repeatedly to just make a ton of 3/3s here.
Oh, that sounds sweet.
And so I also have like the red and the blue enchantments from original Innistrad. One draws your card, one shocks when you play something from your graveyard. The only issue I have with the Lost and the Damned is that if you fetch, you get a 3/3 because you're putting a land to play from your library.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
that makes it so it's just a card you should usually just be playing in most decks rather than a cool like build around that defines the color pair.
That's really interesting. What a double-edged sword there. Because I like you've sold me on this. If I see this in a pack, my inclination would be to take it because that sounds like a really cool interaction. But then in a way I'm not playing Is It, I'm playing fetch lands.
Yeah, well, like good luck getting a fetch land too, but because there's no white, there's only six fetch lands. There's
Oh yeah.
other like pseudo fetch lands. You know, there's cards that can put a land from your library into your deck, but they're not going to be as good rate as actual fetch lands.
Do you think of fetch lands kind of like power in a way? Like for something like that?
I don't think of them as power, although they did go in like the first two picks in like the last roto draft we did, and I think that is correct. Like one player went first pick fetch, second pick fetch. I think the power of the cube is actually more in the spells, just because if you don't get a fetch land, you can still get a dual land, you can still get a shock land. Like the second best land is still pretty good. I mean, obviously they're not as good as a fetch in this cube. You can also find yourself in a spot where you're struggling to find fetchable targets
Yeah.
because it's a desert cube. you have to draft all the lands. So you have to find the lands of the types. And there's a lot of lands with the basic types. But also because you're milling yourself so much, it's very common that you just mill all your targets. So if you only had like 3 or 4 targets for a fetch, you're kind of putting yourself in a dangerous spot where if you draw it late in the game or you left a little bit back, you might just not have a target anymore. So you have to be careful with that.
Boy, that's such an interesting problem if you're if you're burning through your deck that quickly. Gwen, when you're working on this project, do you think in terms of archetypes, or are the synergies more broad than that?
I think this cube is actually really interesting when it comes to archetypes because it's less of a list of slightly overlapping archetypes across a bunch of colors and more of a long list of themes that kind of blend together. Like every deck is playing out of the graveyard. Every deck is trying to take advantage of like one of the dimensions of life in the loam. And so like life in the loam itself, there's a lot of angles with it. So there's the dredge aspect where you can facilitate really high octane graveyard decks by being able to get started on dredging on turn one. But there's also cards that benefit from always having a land drop, right? So there's like landfall cards, and there's like a whole class of decks that just are playing a mostly fair strategy, but taking advantage of the fact that you will always hit your land drops. There's decks that care about cards as a resource versus like the quality of cards. So, like I mentioned earlier, like Zombie Infestation is a card that just cares about the raw quantity of cards, and Left Alone helps you facilitate that. There's also a handful of like niche themes, like when a card like leaves your graveyard, for example, like Willow Geist is pretty insane with cards like Left Alone because you can dredge Left Alone. That's returning a card from your graveyard to your hand, and so you put a counter on it. But then when you cast Left Alone, you also get a trigger because you're putting more cards from your graveyard to your hand. And I've seen people use Dryad Arbor to turn Loam into a way to get like whenever a creature leaves your graveyard trigger
Sure.
uh,
Oh yeah.
with things like Insidious Roots, and you can craft like really crazy stuff there. And so once you kind of have like a basis for like understanding the different vectors Life in the Loam works at, then you kind of have like obvious archetypes, but then once you kind of lay out like your obvious archetypes, then there's this like second layer of archetypes that kind of emerge because they're good with your first archetypes. I think one of the Lucky Paper episodes they talked about this really well. They were focused on trade routes. Were you able to listen to that episode?
Yeah, where they use that as kind of the seed crystal design and building out from there.
Exactly, and that's actually I listened to the episode as I was doing like the first two drafts of this cube, and it was like, yeah, this is exactly how I think about the cube and how the cube is put together. But also like as a result of this kind of like design philosophy is the decks are very sludgy in terms of like archetypes. Like they cross over so much that you're less drafting like a cohesive archetype and more drafting almost like an engine or a pile of like different themes and trying to like pull it together into a single deck. I think the best example I have is I would draft decks where I want to be able to discard cards um, for like Zombie Infestation or Scuttle Tide. And as a result, I'm able to fill up my graveyard quickly, so I can discard cards like Golgari Grave Troll to mill faster. And so I'm able to put meaningful threat on the board with all these like token makers and be able to control the board like that. But then also, like once I get my library very low cards, I actually have like a Laboratory Maniac that I'm able to bring back because I crafted this loop of Volrath Stronghold, and so I'm able to left and alone back Volrath Stronghold, which means I can put Laboratory Maniac back on my deck always. And so I've crafted these what I call like loops in order to provide like inevitability or ways for me to like answer certain problematic cards I might see. And that's kind of how I think about the cube.
That's interesting. That reminds me a lot of how my friend Greg or Den Horror would talk about the companion cube, where you're using these small packets of interaction. And especially in something like this, where you're going to see, in many cases, a lot of your deck each game. that you can lean into that. So while you may not be a zombie infestation deck or a specific laboratory maniac deck, the likelihood that you're going to see that is so much higher, and so you can build toward that without it being like an explicit title of the deck.
Yeah, exactly.
I will note, since you mentioned, this is probably the best that Willowgeist has looked in any environment, so kudos for that.
Willowgeist is actually really good. Uh, I, I I think I was kind of giving one of my players a really hard time because they had passed me a Willowgeist, and then we played like round two. And the moment they passed me Willowgeist, I showed them the card and I said, "This is a mistake. You shouldn't have passed me this card." And then I played it against them. I played it turn one. I got out to a 5/5 in like a couple of turns, and just ran them over.
Because it
Um,
has trample too. Ooh.
it's and even if you answer it, then you like gain some life. It's like okay, the card's really good.
It's all context dependent, right? Like so, but I think that's so cool that it gets to do something special here that's you wouldn't do other places.
Yeah, it's a cool card.
Gwen, as you consider Loam Cube, what advice would you offer to other designers as they're working on their own projects?
The best advice I can have is just to play the cube a lot. I know this has probably been said a lot, but when I first pitched the idea to my play group, we have a Discord and we have a thread channel. So we just create a thread when we create a new cube so we can talk about that cube. The reception was mostly like laughing emojis. But then I actually put it together, and then I actually like organized the draft day. It's like, hey, we're gonna play this cube. I think let's try it out. It's mostly proxy. So there's no real sunk cost. And the first draft was just a lot of fun. And ever since, my players have just been really excited about the cube, and we played quite regularly.
That's so encouraging to hear. And I mean, what are friends for other than to put laugh emojis on your ideas? But how good to hear that it went from that to where we are now, which is something really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's just get it together, even if the list is really, really rough, really untuned. Just get a list together and play it because nothing will give you more insight into how like good the idea is or into how good your card selections are, compared to actual gameplay. Like you just need to run drafts. I also have some players in my play group who have a cube, or they started making a cube, and they've found that they're struggling getting those playtest drafts in. And the way I always am able to get drafts is I say, okay, we're going to cube on this day. Here's the location. Here's the time. We're going to do this cube, and then whatever second cube people want to play. And so that way, people are like, okay, I can show up to cube, and we always do 2 or 3 cube drafts. And that way, players can be like, okay, I'm willing to try this one thing because afterwards I know it's a cube I'm going to really like. And so that helps with like getting players to sign up. I found.
I like that. That's a good tool. Like even if you don't like this new thing, there's something that you can enjoy after that. But hopefully you enjoy both.
Yeah, and also people also generally are okay trying out your cube that's potentially unbalanced if you're like kind of doing the legwork to organize 8 people together. So those people who seem to like not be like launching their cube, that's I think what they need to be doing more is just be the person who says, "Hey, we're going to draft on this cube this day. I want to get a player to my cube, and then we can do something else." And that's been really successful for me.
That's good. It's tough to it can be tough to get people in the room, but it is worth doing. Well, one of the things I wanted to chat with you about, in addition to your cube design and event organization things, you're also the founder and admin of CubeCobra, which is, I think it's fair to say, the premier MTG cube management platform. Can you talk a bit about how CubeCobra came about?
Yeah, so I the way it started was oh man, it was a while ago. It must have been 2019, I want to say. Maybe 2018 even. But so I just finished my bachelor's degree and I had quit Magic when I was doing my bachelor's. I just didn't have the time or money to play Magic. And I had this like period of 5 or so months before I started my first job. I was living with my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, and she was working, and I was just bumming at home until my job started. So I decided to try to do something meaningful with my time. And so I had a couple of projects that were kind of like sitting in the back of my mind. And one of them was that I really like designing cubes, despite not playing, haven't played Magic for years. And I really didn't like Cube Tutor. Or it's not that I didn't like it. I had several things that made the tool frustrating to use. And I think Cube Tutor was a great tool for its time. It did a lot for the Cube community, and I'm like really, really grateful it exists.
There was really nothing else at the time other than, Microsoft Excel to build your cubes.
Yeah, I also saw people put cubes in tapped out, which is like pretty psychotic, but you got to do what you got to do.
That's right.
Yeah, and so I wanted to design a tool that I could use to design cubes for myself. And so I was building it out, and as I started building it out, I realized this should actually be a website because other people that I've showed it to wanted to try it out. And so I made it into a website. It used to be like a desktop app, if you can believe it or not.
Wow.
and and it just kind of it the community latched onto it really well. I got a lot of really positive reception, and it really just kind of motivated me to continue doing it. And we're still growing now, and I think that's more of a facet that like the cube community has been growing. But like the first year, we saw a lot of adoption already, and I think like that December, a few people have been talking to me that they really thought it would be a good idea to open source it. I had no idea like the ramifications of open source, and I wasn't sure if it was like risky.
Yeah, high level, what does that mean to open source it?
Yeah, so open source is basically the idea is that you take your software and you post the source code to GitHub so that everyone can see it. And there's really two main ramifications. And the first is something that I was worried about, and that is that your vulnerabilities are much easier to find. But that's actually not a bad thing because most people are good actors, and when they'll find a vulnerability, they'll tell you about it so you can fix it. And so having access to the source code actually improves the security of your site in a way because you're able to get these vulnerabilities patched that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. But it also means that people who just do hobbyist software development, like I do, are able to contribute to the site and add new features or fix bugs that I personally wouldn't have the capacity to finish because I only have so much time. Once I started it, I had a lot of developers come in, and I realized that I had not been the only one who was kind of itching to build a better tool that's like long term more sustainable. And so I've kind of geared the project, and the way I've thought about the project is a tool that's really built by the community to serve the community, and that's been kind of like my guiding philosophy ever since I decided to open source it. So that's kind of how the website came about. I mean, we've come a long way since then.
I don't know if you would remember this. Our first conversation, I stumbled into one of the Discord chat channels while you were just in a group there, and you were talking some about building and working with the draft bots for CubeCobra. And you were mentioning how that overlapped with your educational process, and you actually shared a presentation you were working on
Yeah.
with me, a complete stranger at the time. Um, yeah, can you speak a little bit to how your work contributed to the draft bots?
Yeah, so I've always done like a little bit of machine learning stuff. Like in my undergrad, I took like a class. I found it interesting. My capstone project was actually this is some deep lore. Uh, my capstone project for my bachelor's was building software for a magic card sorting machine. I don't know how I was able to land this, but this is like a company approached my college and was like, I want to build this. And we're the team that built one of these like really, really early versions. I don't think it's the same thing that like these industrial, like the newest card sorting machines use, but we did prototype one of the first ones. And so yeah,
That's so cool.
I've done a handful of like machine learning stuff. And so for my masters, I took it up as like a focus area. And I think during that time, Ryan Sachs, who's also like pretty well known in the cube community for building cool cubes and doing data science stuff, he approached me and he pitched me this idea to make the draft bots a lot better. And he proposed a completely new system, said, "Here, I will build it. If you give me the data, I will train it on my work issued machine that can train these networks for free for you."
So
Which,
cool.
given our budget, was like that's what we need to do. And so he designed and built the system, and it was mostly him at first. If you would call like my naive like programmatic solution like the level one draft bots, this is like the level two. And for my capstone for my masters, it took me a while to do my masters because I was doing part time while I was working. It took me four and a half years. But for my capstone, no, not sorry, it was my capstone, but it was for a machine learning course I was taking. I think it was the second to last course. So it must have been 2023. We had to basically do a course project that combined, the concepts we learned in class, and we could use any data set. So I went to my professor and I was like, "Here's my pitch for the project. There's this website called CubeCobra. It publishes its data, for like data science nerds to play around with, and it's also open source, by the way. I want to build a model to do X, Y, and Z, and I can also submit it as an open source contribution to the website." I didn't really disclose that, it is my website, but the professor did agree.
Yeah, that part less important, I guess.
So, but this is great because I was able to work on improvements for CubeCobra while also like working on my requirements for my class,
That's
and
amazing.
it worked out great. And so I took Ryan's model, and we Ryan and I talked a ton, and we collaborated for a while. But because it's for my class, like I did all the actual work. I actually did all the coding, did the data transformations for the training. But Ryan definitely like mentored me quite a bit, and he was like instrumental to success. And the new model, that's the model that's live now and for the foreseeable future, is this really cool architecture where it's one model that can do multiple functions. The core of the model is it can take a list of cards and transform it into what we call like an embedding. I guess I'll try to keep this topic easy to understand for like non data science people. But it takes like a list of cards and turns into this like really abstract, very like hard for humans to understand list of numbers, and the information is much more dense. And you can take that embedding and then put it into one of the three networks that we trained alongside this model that creates the embedding. And the three functions we have are drafting, deck building, and recommending. And so recommending is what the first model did, is the only thing the first model could do, actually. And how it works is it tries to look at a cube and try to figure out what's missing. And the way that we train this is we take all the cubes and then we remove a few cards from it. And then we train it to try to reconstruct what the missing cards were. And what we found is it loves to recommend like Lightning Bolt, Land of Owls, whatever, all the most common cards. And so what we did is when we remove the cards or when we mask the original cube, we do it based on card popularity. So like the chance that we mask, like we remove Lightning Bolt, is lower because it's a common card. And if it's an uncommon card, like a card that's not often included in cubes, the chance that we remove that one is much higher. And what we found then is the recommendations are much better catered towards your themes and less of whatever are the most popular cards are.
Was that system using Elo at that time, or was that added later?
So the only system that used ELO was the V1, and the current draft bots don't use ELO at all. So the draft bots for like the current model, what they do is they take the cards you've picked as the list of cards and convert into an embedding, and then they try to answer the question of, given that these are the cards I've drafted, what cards do I want to see? And then you compare that list with the cards in the pack, and you're able to like rank the cards in the pack based on how much you want it. And this system has its limitations itself because it doesn't take into account like the context of the cube, which is something that we can add. We just the challenging part is actually building the data set for that, but it's something that we can do. And the last function is taking a list of a entire pool and then ranking the cards based on how likely you are to include it in your deck. And that's what is the basis for the deck builder. And so that's the system I built for like my master's class, and then I shipped it. And I think the systems worked really well. There's a couple key limitations that are worth mentioning. So like the first is because the entire system operates under this like list of cards, the way it like represents it in like form of data is a vector of length equal to all the cards in Magic, and it sounds big, but it's actually it's not that bad.
No, it just sounds wild to a non-programming brain like mine.
Yeah, so like a vector, the length equal to the number of unique cards gameplay wise. So not like printing wise, but in terms of like Oracle ID. So like it doesn't matter what version of Lightning Bolt you have. It's all the same to the model, which is how it should be, right? A 0 means the card is not on the list. A 1 is the card is in the list. So there's the two limitations around this is that it can't account for multiples of cards. Like you could say, yeah, well, you can make it a 2, but because our training data is not rich enough to support that kind of stuff, a 2 is kind of nonsensical and it just like doesn't work. And also the length of the vector being equal to the number of magic cards. Well, what if they release more magic cards? Like they
What
do.
if?
Well, then all of a sudden your model becomes outdated, and so we have to retrain it. But retraining is a long and expensive process because we no longer have access to some hardware being
Yeah.
donated to us. So we actually like pay for it ourselves, and so we can't retrain on a too regular basis. But maybe there's some developments coming out, where we are able to retrain it more frequently. But so I've retrained it twice since I first launched it, and it's at the point where I'm going to retrain it again pretty soon. But until it's been retrained, all the cards that have come out since it was last trained, the model is blind to. And so it becomes more and more apparent the longer it's been untrained. But like Modern Horizons 3 cards, it is blind to and it won't pick because it doesn't know how to evaluate these cards because it wasn't in the training data. So that's a pretty big limitation. I mean, the answer to like that problem is there's kind of like two ways we could do it that we've brainstormed. The first is we can train more frequently. But even then, it's not perfect because it's going to have gaps. And also, if you train it like the moment the cards come out, you don't have any training data because people haven't done any playtest drafts yet. So it's kind of pointless. And the second is you can come up with a model that evaluates cards based on the text. So if you can imagine that we came up with these like embeddings for a list of cards, what you can also do is you can come up with embeddings based on actual card text and try to get that into its own like vector space. But then you can take a card that's outside of the training data, get its text, and then get a vector for that card. And so that's a way for like a machine learning model to kind of reason with cards that it doesn't have any playtest data of because it can kind of approximate the vector space compared to other cards.
But that also sounds like a lot of front end work to to teach a system how to parse text for over 30,000 cards.
It's definitely out of my time budget for sure.
But that's exciting to hear that there are still so many possibilities, and always opportunities for growth. I wanted to ask, considering the work that you've done on CubeCobra, which is remarkable, do you feel pressure as like the admin of something like this because it touches so many people?
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes it's pretty stressful. So when I first launched this, we didn't really have a budget. I was just like basically paying for it, out of pocket. And I eventually set up a Patreon to cover costs, but the site has never been profitable. And I was at the point where I was kind of rolling my own solutions for most of the stuff. And because I was rolling my own, there's more issues because you don't have these like teams of developers that are working on the product behind the scenes, right? It's like you have to spin up your own database, if your database runs out of memory, runs out of disk space, or has like a network issue. It's like all number of things that could go wrong, and things just do go wrong. And so the first year or so, maybe even 2 years, we had a lot of just like random downtime, and that was really stressful because I couldn't like go out on the weekends anymore out of worrying that there's downtime, and now downtime is extended by an hour because I have to like go back home.
Mm.
And that was really difficult because then it was like affecting like my relationship with my girlfriend, now wife. So like one of the decisions I made with the site is to try to move as much of it into like managed solutions as I could, because that way it would be more resilient, and I would be able to like provide better availability, less downtime for the users, while also like being able to like go out for the weekend and not worrying about it, the site going down for whatever reason. And that's helped a lot. But the flip side of that is these things are more expensive. And so it's always like a balance of using our budget to make the site run smoothly versus going for the cheaper option, and being smarter with the budget, doing more with less, but also like taking up more of my time. And that's been really challenging. I think we're at a pretty good spot right now. We have advertisements on the website, and actually, I just shipped an update that increased some of the advertisements, and that helps cover like our baseline. It doesn't cover the entire like costs, but like that plus Patreon like just about covers it, and so we're like usually pretty good. But it can be stressful. Also, like a week ago, we were under attack by spam bots. It wasn't a targeted thing. It was just a huge amount of increase in volume, and that sucks. And I kind of have a responsibility to fix that. At first, it was causing an availability issue because so many spam bots were hitting the website that it was effectively like a DDoS attack, where the servers were overwhelmed and they couldn't serve requests for regular traffic. So like our latency, which is normally like 100 milliseconds on average, went up to 4 seconds, which is
Whoa.
horrendous. I got a lot of complaints like, hey, the site's not loading for me because it's slow, and then sometimes like the browser times out, and like all sorts of things. And so I had to do a couple of things in order to kind of protect the site against that. And I fixed the availability issue. Like I added a firewall layer, kind of like Cloudflare, but like the AWS equivalent, and that's helped with the volume. But that's also not free. So now
Yeah,
I'm now
yeah.
now, now my bill is higher, and now I'm also looking at the numbers and saying, I don't want to be losing money on this, right? That also makes it tough.
Yeah, there's certainly a balance with your hobbies where there can be an investment, but you don't want it to be like a cost like that. I hope users have been encouraging to you over time because I know what you're doing is filling such a critical niche for so many designers and players.
I think in general the users are understanding. They understand that like these things are they're not free to host, and if the ads help pay for it, people are understanding. There is still like a subset of people who are like, I don't care, I'm gonna use my ad blocker. I mean, it's whatever. People are always gonna use ad blockers. Like we have a Patreon, and if you just give $1 a month, you can link it and you don't get ads, which I think is a pretty good deal. And so like a lot of people really do support the site in that way, and so that's really heartwarming to see.
And I appreciate you sharing about that. This is kind of a linchpin of how many people do design these days. And it's been really fun to see the site develop over time and your work that's gone into it. It's really evident that it's a passion project for you.
Yeah, I mean that's like another thing. It's like part of the reason why another tool doesn't exist is because like the development time and cost is so high compared to like the potential returns. It's like we're not
You
like
mean you mean you're not doing it for the big cube player bucks?
yeah, exactly, right. But like in seriousness, like the real consequence of that is like the tools are take so much time and expertise to write that nobody is doing it because it's not profitable, right? So the only people that are doing it, it's not just me, it's all the contributors who are working to make the site better as well. They're just doing it out of the love of the game, really. And so that's I think that's really remarkable to see is there's so many people in the community who are so passionate, and have the right skill set that they're able to give back in that way. And I think that that's part of what makes this community really special.
Well, Gwen, as we are trending toward wrapping up here, I wanted to ask you one of my favorite questions. If you could have any magic card printed as a promo, which one would you pick and who would you have do the illustration?
That's tough. I mean, the most obvious card that comes to mind is Life in the Loam, but I'm collecting the serialized ones, so I wouldn't even have a use for a promo one.
Oh, yeah, the hunt continues, right? You're 3 down, is that right?
I have five.
5. Oh, man.
Yeah, and I'm trying to get 1 through 8, so I can hand them out as to each person as their like seating assignments.
That's so cool.
But I obviously I haven't been able to find literally 1 through 8, so I compromise. I have like 401, 402. I have 88, for 8, and things
Sure.
like that. I do have number 5 though, 5 of 500. So that's kind of the best seat.
That's so good.
But to answer your original question, another project people might know is Decker Cube. I kind of retired it, and I'm now working on like a vintage cube with the same alters. So like any card that doesn't have the extended or like the borderless, that's like something I'm generally interested in. But like I don't know, I can't think of anything on top of my head.
No, that's just fine. Well, Gwen, this has been a pleasure for me, and I so appreciate you taking your time to share about Loam Cube, share about CubeCobra. If people want to follow up on any of your projects or perhaps buy you a cup of coffee, what would be the best place for us to point them?
I'm most responsive on Discord, but you can also catch me on Blue Sky these days. And I have the Patreon if you're interested in supporting the website.
But thank you again so much. Looking forward to, I have your website pulled up right now, working on what we're talking about. I'm using it for my own projects, and I'm so thrilled that we get to keep doing that. Before we sign off, you probably want to also plug an upcoming event, right?
Yeah, so we have Boston Q Party coming up in April. It's an opportunity to play Loam Cube if that's interesting to you. I think we will sell out. So if you're interested in coming, try to get your tickets. And also, just thanks for having me on the podcast, kid. It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine, Gwen. Thank you so much.